Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the very first time if you're new around here. I'm your friendly neighborhood YouTuber, always on the hunt for interesting stories, hidden gems, and jaw-dropping moments around the city. If you haven't already done so, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what I've got in store today. Let's rewind a bit and talk about Valerie, because if you don't know who she is and where she came from, you can't fully appreciate what went down at the diner that night. Picture a girl growing up on Chicago's West Side, an area with tough streets and limited opportunities. She didn't come from money, and she didn't have a big support system pushing her toward any particular dream. But what she did have was a fierce drive and a love for physical challenges. In her early teens, Valerie stumbled upon a rundown gym that offered youth boxing classes. It was the kind of place that smelled of old sweat and disinfectant, with worn-out gloves piled in corners and punching bags patched up with duct tape. The coach there, an ex-boxer named Ray, ran the gym more like a community center. He'd let neighborhood kids come in after school to keep them off the streets. Most kids dropped out after a week or two, complaining about the early call times, the rigorous workouts, or the strict rules about showing respect. Valerie was different. She showed up every single day, even when the weather was freezing, even when she was exhausted from homework and chores. Ray quickly noticed her dedication. She had an intensity in her eyes that said she wasn't just looking for an after-school hobby. She was looking for a purpose. Little by little, she learned the fundamentals: proper stance, balanced footwork, how to keep her guard up, and how to throw a jab that snapped like a rubber band. As months turned into years, Valerie started competing in local tournaments, often facing off against older and more experienced fighters. Some people looked down on her, partly because she was younger, partly because she was a girl in a male-dominated sport. But she thrived on that underestimation. By the time she was 17, she had a string of wins under her belt. Word got around that if you saw Valerie's name on the fight card, you'd better not blink, or you'd miss the knockout. Eventually, she attracted the attention of a more established coach who helped her transition from local bouts to regional competitions. This meant more structured training, sponsors who provided slightly better gear, and road trips to cities she never thought she'd see. Ray remained a mentor, but Valerie's world was expanding. By her early 20s, she'd officially turned pro. She wasn't a household name like some boxing legends, but she made enough waves in the circuit to earn a national title in her weight class. Yet professional boxing takes a toll on the body. Over the span of 5 years, Valerie racked up a list of injuries: a sprained ankle here, a cracked rib there, and eventually a serious wrist fracture that required surgery. Each time, doctors would advise her to slow down, maybe even step away completely. Each time, she gritted her teeth and pressed on until the injuries piled up too high to ignore. The final straw was a shoulder injury that refused to heal properly, making it clear that continuing to fight at a high level could risk permanent damage. So, she made the painful decision to retire. It was like stepping away from the only life she'd ever known, the identity that had defined her. She talked about the depression that followed, a lingering sense of loss, as if she was mourning a part of herself. But with time, she found new ways to apply her skills. She got certified as a personal trainer, began teaching self-defense classes for women, and even volunteered at her old gym, mentoring kids who reminded her of her younger self. By the time I crossed paths with her at that diner, she'd settled into a quieter life. She had a few close friends, a modest apartment, and a routine that didn't involve weigh-ins, press conferences, or the roar of a crowd. Yet underneath it all, the discipline and instincts of a fighter remained. She still ran early in the mornings, shadowboxed to keep her reflexes sharp, and carried herself with that unspoken confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself in almost any situation. That's the Valerie who sat at the diner table that evening, sipping iced tea, reflecting on her boxing past with a mixture of fondness and relief that she'd found a new path. If you just glanced at her, you'd never guess she'd once stepped into the ring with top-tier opponents. She looked so calm, so at ease, chatting with her 2 friends about everyday stuff like weekend plans and the best place to grab late-night tacos. No one at that diner had any idea that within minutes, Valerie's well-honed instincts would switch from casual conversation to life-saving action. She didn't know it herself, or how could she? Real life doesn't schedule dramatic moments for your convenience. They crash into you, and you either rise to the occasion or falter. And Valerie, as we were all about to see, was definitely someone who rose to the occasion. The transition from a peaceful summer evening to a tense standoff happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, the murmur of light conversation filled the patio. The next, Everyone froze as this visibly intoxicated man stumbled into view. From my vantage point, I saw him pause near the hostess stand, glare at a waitress, and ask, no, demand, a beer. The waitress looked flustered, explaining that the diner didn't serve alcohol. He responded with a barrage of profanity that made several customers turn their heads. It was that kind of scene where you instinctively hold your breath, hoping the stranger will get bored or realize he's in the wrong place and just wander off. But he didn't. Instead, he scanned the tables, lingering on faces as if challenging each person to say something. His eyes landed on Valerie's group, possibly because they weren't reacting to his outburst. Drunken bravado often zeroes in on perceived indifference. It's like they want an excuse to unload their anger on someone who isn't showing fear. He swaggered over, almost tripping on a loose board in the wooden patio. He slammed his fist against the edge of Valerie's table, making the glasses rattle ominously. One of her friends looked startled but tried to stay calm, telling him this wasn't the time or place for aggression. That only stoked the man's fury. He started slurring threats, calling them names, insisting they'd better watch themselves. You could feel the collective anxiety of the diner's patrons. A few people edged away, uncertain whether to intervene or alert the staff. Others looked like they wanted to help but didn't know how. I was torn. Should I step in, or would I just escalate the situation? And what about filming it? Was it ethical to whip out a camera in the middle of a potentially dangerous confrontation? Before I could decide, the man reached out and grabbed the front of the older friend's shirt, yanking him forward so violently that the chair screeched against the concrete. That was the snap of a tension line that had been ready to break. Gasps erupted all around. The waitress he'd harassed earlier dashed inside, presumably to call the police. And that's when Valerie made her move. She rose from her seat in one swift motion. No theatrics, no shouted warnings. Her left hand came up to block the man's raised arm. He looked like he was about to throw a punch, while her right hand pressed against his upper body. With a slight shift of her hips, she pushed him off balance, forcing him to release his grip on her friend. The precision was almost surgical, like something you'd see in a carefully choreographed demonstration, except this was real life. For a moment, the drunk stared at her, confused by how easily she'd stopped him. Then came the wave of anger. He swore loudly, pulling back his fist to strike again. Valerie stood her ground, her stance relaxed yet purposeful. As he swung, she ducked, letting his fist sail over her shoulder. She followed with a short, controlled jab to his midsection. It was more a warning shot than a knockout punch, enough to make him gasp. But not enough to floor him. People around us watched in a mix of horror and fascination. You could almost hear hearts pounding. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, she knows what she's doing." Another person muttered something about calling for security. The man, fueled by alcohol and bruised pride, refused to back down. He rushed at Valerie again, telegraphing every move with flailing limbs. She sidestepped gracefully, hooking his arm and using his momentum to pivot him around and send him stumbling. He lost his footing, crashing onto the hard ground with a thud. That was the moment it became clear we were witnessing a trained fighter in action. Valerie wasn't just fending him off. She was controlling the entire interaction, using minimal force to protect herself and her friends. The man groaned, rolling onto his side, presumably both humiliated and confused. She stepped back, hands open at her sides to show she wasn't going to continue the fight unless he forced her to. "Stay down," she said, her voice firm but not angry. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. The man glared up at her, cursing, but he made no move to get up. And then, after a beat or two, the diner staff and a couple of bystanders rushed in. Someone must have called the cops, because sirens were already wailing in the distance. I can't overstate the surreal atmosphere at that point. Here we were, on what was supposed to be a quiet evening, watching a scene that felt straight out of an action movie. The difference was, in an action movie, the hero often grandstands. Valerie did the opposite. She looked almost apologetic, like she wished it hadn't come to this. But anyone could see that if she hadn't intervened, her friend might have been seriously hurt. And who knew what else this drunk might have done? Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. Officers rushed over, assessing the chaotic scene: an overturned chair, a shattered water glass, a crowd of onlookers, and a drunk man sprawled on the pavement. Valerie stood calmly off to the side, letting bystanders explain what had happened. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. This guy had started the confrontation. She'd ended it. While the officers questioned the man, who was still spouting curses, Valerie quietly told another officer her side of the story. "I caught snippets. He grabbed my friend. I tried to de-escalate. I used the minimum force I could. The officer nodded, clearly seeing the evidence. The man was intoxicated and out of control. The crowd backed up her account. As for me, I was still too stunned to even think about filming the aftermath. It didn't feel right to turn such a raw, frightening moment into content. Eventually, the paramedics arrived. They checked the drunk's vitals and helped him to his feet. He was still cursing, though his slurred words carried no weight against the mountain of eyewitness testimony. The police arrested him for public intoxication and possible assault. As he was led to the squad car, he shouted at Valerie, but she didn't react. She simply turned her attention to her friend, making sure he wasn't hurt. Just like that, the chaos subsided. Some patrons tried to return to their meals, though the air remained thick with tension. Others decided they'd had enough excitement for one evening and quietly settled their bills. I stood there, heart pounding, thinking, did that really just happen? And the most incredible part was that Valerie looked more concerned about everyone else's well-being than her own. No triumphant grin, no self-congratulations. She radiated a sense of calm, as if to say, it's over now. Let's move on. The police had barely driven away when the diner's manager rushed over to Valerie, nearly breathless from nerves. She was a woman in her 50s, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and she looked torn between thanking Valerie and apologizing for the whole fiasco. I'm so sorry, she kept repeating. Are you okay? Is your friend all right? Valerie offered a reassuring nod, insisting they were fine. Her friend, still wide-eyed, adjusted his rumpled shirt collar for the 100th time. He said, I swear, I've known you for years, but I've never seen you in action like that. Valerie just shrugged. I wish I didn't have to, she replied softly. Over the next half hour, the patio buzzed with a kind of subdued energy. It wasn't exactly panic anymore, more like the shaky relief that sets in when you realize you've just dodged a major disaster. The staff cleaned up the broken glass, mopped the spilled drinks, and tried to restore the welcoming vibe they prided themselves on. A couple of the diners came up to Valerie to express their gratitude. One older gentleman, a regular at the diner, said he'd never seen anyone handle a situation so calmly. Valerie smiled politely, but you could tell she was uncomfortable with the attention. I finally mustered the courage to approach her, carefully. I introduced myself, explaining I was a YouTuber and had actually come to review the diner tonight. Valerie looked surprised, maybe a bit wary that I might sensationalize her. I assured her I wasn't looking for clickbait material. I just felt it was important to capture the reality of what went down. She hesitated, then said, do what you need to. But please, don't turn this into some big heroic tale. I'm not a hero. I just did what I had to. She thanked the manager for the meal, insisting on paying her check anyway, even though the manager tried to comp it. Her friends paid theirs as well, still in a slight daze. It struck me how normal Valerie tried to keep everything. She wasn't shouting or bragging or replaying her moves. She was just quietly confirming her friend was okay, then planning to head home. In that moment, I saw a glimpse of the code she lived by: use your skills when necessary, then carry on without fanfare. Once the tension had cooled, a few of us stuck around, sipping coffee and talking in hushed tones about what had just happened. The manager sat down, too, visibly shaken. In all my years running this place, I've never had anything like that happen, she said. That guy he came out of nowhere. One of Valerie's friends speculated that maybe he'd been bar hopping and ended up at the diner by mistake, looking for more alcohol. Another diner chimed in that she'd seen him earlier up the block, shouting at random people, so he'd likely been on a collision course all evening. Meanwhile, Valerie stood by the patio railing, phone in hand, checking for messages. I noticed she still had that distant look in her eyes, the one people get when adrenaline is fading and reality is sinking in. It made me wonder about the toll an incident like that takes on someone who's trying to live a peaceful life after years of combat training. When you're a retired athlete, especially in a combat sport, the mental shift away from fight mode can be enormous. And yet, there she was, handling it with quiet composure. Soon, she walked back over and joined the conversation, albeit briefly. She reiterated that she was glad nobody got hurt. Someone asked her if she had any regrets about stepping in. She paused for a moment, then shook her head. I don't regret protecting my friend, she said. I just regret that it escalated at all. But sometimes, you don't get to choose. For me, that summed it up perfectly. She hadn't gone looking for a fight, but she refused to back down when it mattered. As the night wore on, the crowd thinned. People headed home with more than just a full stomach. They left with a story they'd be talking about for weeks. A couple of folks even joked about feeling safer on the streets now, knowing Valerie lived in the neighborhood. By the time I finally wrapped up my impromptu interviews and jotted down some notes, it was nearly 11 p.m. The neon sign buzzed overhead, and the traffic had dwindled to a trickle. Valerie and her friends said their goodbyes to the staff, then walked off into the night. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty table where all this drama had unfolded. It was almost hard to believe that just an hour earlier, that very spot had been ground zero for a confrontation that could have turned downright ugly. Feeling the weight of the day's events, I packed up my camera gear. I'd captured enough B-roll of the diner, but the story I'd ended up with was far bigger than just a restaurant review. Part of me was relieved that I hadn't filmed every second of the fight. It felt too personal, too raw to exploit for views. Another part of me knew I couldn't just ignore it. Something important had happened here, something worth sharing carefully, respectfully, without sensationalism. In the days that followed, I sat down to edit my footage, which was mostly shots of the diner's exterior, its decor, the friendly waitstaff, and the mouth-watering food I'd sampled. In my usual vlogs, that would be enough for a nice 10-minute segment. But now I had this entire other layer of reality overshadowing my initial plan. People at the diner that night had scattered into the city, carrying with them a story about a near disaster that was narrowly averted by an ex-boxer's swift intervention. I wrestled with how to present it on my channel. On one hand, it was the biggest event I'd stumbled upon in a long time, pure, unscripted drama. On the other hand, Valerie had asked me not to blow it out of proportion. After a few sleepless nights, I finally decided on a format. I'd mention what happened, offer a brief account without showing any aggressive footage, which I hadn't really captured, anyway, and focus on the takeaway. That real heroes are the ones who act with both skill and conscience, using force only when there's no other choice. The video went live a week later. I titled it something like Local Diner Review plus a Real-Life Moment of Bravery. I was careful not to plaster Valerie's name or face all over the thumbnail. Instead, the video opened with my usual commentary about the diner's atmosphere, its history, and some shots of the delicious meals they served. Then, about halfway through, I calmly recounted the confrontation. I explained how a drunken stranger had shown up, threatening people, and how a former boxer stepped in to de-escalate the situation. I never showed the actual scuffle, just offered a few words about how quickly things can escalate and how crucial it is to remain prepared. The response was massive. People flooded the comments section, expressing disbelief, admiration, and a flurry of questions. Who is she? Did you get her on camera? Why didn't you film the whole fight? A handful of viewers criticized me for not capturing everything, but a surprising number praised me for respecting the privacy of those involved. Some viewers shared their own stories of close calls with aggression, mentioning how they wished they'd had the training to respond effectively. A few days later, I got a message from the diner's manager. She thanked me for the fair coverage and said business had actually picked up, a mix of locals curious about the place and new customers who'd seen the video. She also mentioned that the staff felt more assured knowing there were people in the neighborhood who wouldn't stand for random violence. It's a strange kind of silver lining, she wrote. But at least something good is coming out of that scary night. I also heard that the drunken man was facing charges for assault and disorderly conduct. Whether he'd learn his lesson was anyone's guess. As for Valerie, she continued her life much as before, training clients, teaching self-defense, and keeping a low profile. Word trickled out among her students about what she'd done, and naturally, they were a bit starstruck. I had no idea Coach Val was a real-life hero, one teenage girl gushed in a comment on my channel. But Valerie never capitalized on it or tried to go viral. She was just Valerie, a former champion who still had that champion's heart and discipline. When I reflect on that evening, I'm struck by the fact that it all happened so fast. One minute I was setting up a camera for a cozy diner review. The next, I was an eyewitness to a physical altercation that could have ended disastrously if not for Valerie's intervention. It made me realize how easily we can overlook the hidden strengths of the people around us. That quiet woman at a corner table might just be capable of protecting an entire room full of people when push comes to shove. Now, whenever I walk into a local restaurant to do a review, I find myself scanning the crowd, wondering what stories the patrons carry with them. Are there any other ex-champions among us? Or maybe talented musicians, brilliant inventors, or unsung heroes who prefer to remain in the background? The world is full of extraordinary individuals who blend into everyday life until a moment of crisis reveals who they really are. For those of you reading this, I hope the story resonates. Maybe it inspires you to take up a self-defense class or to be more aware of your surroundings. Maybe it highlights the value of staying calm under pressure. Or maybe it simply reminds you that not all heroes wear capes. Some wear hoodies and jeans, pay for their meals, and disappear into the night with no intention of seeking fame. So here's to Valerie and to everyone else who quietly keeps our cities and neighborhoods safer just by being prepared. And here's to you, the viewers and readers, for continuing to follow my channel and showing interest in real-life stories that reveal the depth of human courage. Remember to subscribe for more genuine content, because sometimes the truth is more dramatic than anything we could make up. And, as always, keep your eyes open. You never know when the next extraordinary moment will happen right in front of you.